The climb has been steep and the path dangerous, but the final ascension is finally within your grasp at the peak. Stay with us as we reach the summit of the story and reveal the ultimate truth. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending today.
The last text my brother ever sent me arrived at 6:42 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day. I was standing outside Gate C14 at O'Hare, dragging a carry-on that had seen better days, watching a family in matching sweaters take a selfie near the terminal windows. Snow was coming down sideways. My flight had landed 40 minutes early, and I figured I'd surprise everyone, show up before the turkey was even thawed, prove that I was trying. The screen lit up in my coat pocket. "Don't bother coming. We're doing a smaller thing this year. Melissa doesn't feel comfortable with the whole family around." Melissa, his wife of 14 months. I had been to their wedding. I had given them a KitchenAid mixer off their registry and driven 8 hours round trip to stand in the third row and smile. I read the message twice. Then my mother texted, 1 minute later, like they had coordinated it, which they probably had. "Sweetheart, you understand. You know how Garrett gets. It's just easier this year." I stood there while people streamed past me pulling luggage, while that family in the matching sweaters laughed at whatever showed up on their phone screen. While the announcement system called a boarding group for Phoenix, I typed back 3 words to my brother. "Okay. Happy Thanksgiving." Then I turned off my phone, went to the Dunkin' near baggage claim, ordered a large coffee I didn't need, and sat down on a hard plastic chair to figure out what to do next. My name is Sloan. Wait. No. They called me that in those texts, but that's not who I am anymore. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 31 years old, and for the past 4 years I have been a structural engineer on remote bridge projects in Montana and Wyoming. The kind of work that takes you out of cell range for weeks at a time and teaches you that the most important thing about any structure is what's underneath it, what holds it up when everything above is under pressure. I learned that lesson late when it came to my family. My family. Where to begin? My parents built Calloway Design and Build from nothing, a residential construction company based in Naperville, Illinois, that my father started in a garage with a contractor's license and a used pickup truck. By the time I was in middle school, it was doing $4 million a year. By the time I left for college, it had become something real, a company with a reputation, a portfolio of custom homes, commercial renovations, relationships with every architect and developer in the western suburbs. My father was proud of it, the way only men who built something with their own hands can be proud. My brother Garrett came into the business right after high school. He had no interest in engineering, no interest in design, but he had charm and he was good at sales, and my father handed him a business card that said Vice President of Development before he was 22. I went a different route. I studied civil engineering at University of Illinois, got licensed, worked my way up at a structural firm in Chicago for 6 years before I took the Montana job because I needed to move, needed air, needed distance from a version of myself that had spent too long trying to be seen by people who were looking right through me. I was the middle child. My older sister moved to Portland years ago and had essentially opted out of the family drama entirely, which in retrospect was the wisest thing anyone in my family ever did. I was the one who stayed adjacent. I was the one who kept picking up the phone. For 4 years in Montana, I sent money home where my parents asked. Not huge amounts, but consistent. My mother called it helping with the business overhead, and I called it what it was, which was propping up a company that Garrett had been quietly mismanaging since my father's first heart attack 2 years ago. I knew the numbers were bad. I could see it in the way my father talked around certain questions on our Sunday calls. I could see it in the way my mother stopped mentioning specific projects and started talking in vague terms about things being tight. I tried twice to ask directly. Both times I was told I didn't understand the construction industry, that things moved in cycles, that Garrett had it handled. Garrett had it handled. I was thinking about all of this while I sat in the Dunkin' at O'Hare on Thanksgiving morning with nowhere to go. I had flown in from Billings with a duffel bag full of wine and a sweet potato casserole I'd made the night before, packed in a cooler, which was now in the overhead compartment of a plane I had just gotten off. I had a room reserved at my parents' house. I had been planning this trip for 6 weeks. 3 months before that Thanksgiving, a certified letter had arrived at my apartment in Billings. I had been so swamped with the tail end of a bridge inspection project that I threw it in a pile without opening it. When I finally got to it 2 weeks later, I almost set it aside again because the return address was a law firm in Naperville I didn't recognize. I made coffee and sat down and read it. It was from an attorney named Marcus Webb at a firm called Webb and Associates. The letter informed me that as the named co-signatory on a business line of credit issued to Callaway Design and Build, LLC, I was being notified of a potential default situation. The letter was dense and careful, and I had to read it 3 times to understand what it was actually saying, which was this. My parents had needed a co-signer with strong credit and sufficient income to secure a $1.2 million line of credit 4 years ago. My father had asked me to sign some papers. I remembered it clearly. He called it a formality, said it was just to satisfy the bank's requirements, said my name would never actually be attached to anything meaningful. I signed. I was 27 and I trusted my father. The line of credit had been drawn down almost entirely. The business was in arrears. And there was a clause in the original agreement, one of those dense paragraphs that attorneys bury on page 6, that specified if the primary borrower defaulted, the co-signatory had the right to assume controlling interest in any business assets pledged as collateral. Callaway Design and Build had been pledged as collateral. I sat in my kitchen in Billings for a long time after I finished reading. Outside, the Yellowstone River was doing what it always does, moving forward without asking permission, and I thought about the Sunday phone calls where my father couldn't quite meet my questions directly. I thought about the $800 I wired in March when my mother said payroll was short. I thought about Garrett's Instagram, where he had posted pictures of a ski trip to Vail in January and a new truck in April. I didn't call anyone. I called Marcus Webb. He was thorough, patient, and clearly surprised that I hadn't known any of this was happening. He walked me through the financials. Over the past 3 years, Garrett had drawn down the line of credit through a combination of personal expenses run through the business, a failed condo development in Joliet that he had gotten into without telling my father, and what Marcus described carefully as irregular vendor payments that didn't match any actual invoices in the company's records. My father, in deteriorating health after the second heart attack 8 months ago, had not been reviewing the books closely. My mother had not been reviewing them at all. She had been focused on my father's recovery and had essentially handed Garrett the keys. There was more. Some of the vendor contracts had been signed using a digital signature that appeared to be mine. I have never worked for Callaway Design and Build. I have never signed a vendor contract. The signatures were not mine. I asked Marcus what my options were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that given the clause in the credit agreement, and given the evidence of forgery, I was in a position that most people would consider significant, that I could, if I chose, make a very strong legal argument for assuming control of the business, that the people who had used my name without my knowledge were in serious trouble if I decided to pursue it. I didn't pursue anything that day. I thanked Marcus, told him I needed some time, flew back out to finish the last 2 weeks of my project, and spent those 2 weeks thinking. Then I flew home for Thanksgiving, and my brother texted me not to come. I finished the coffee. I looked up Marcus Webb's number. I sent him a text that said I'm ready to talk. Then I got a hotel room near the airport, unpacked the wine I had brought for my family, and started making calls. The Tuesday after Thanksgiving, I drove to Naperville. I didn't go home first. I went to Marcus's office on Washington Street, a quiet second-floor space above a title company, and I sat across from him for 2 hours while he walked me through everything in detail. The default notice, the forged signatures, the vendor payments that led to 2 shell LLCs registered in Indiana that had no employees and no physical address, the Joliet development which had lost $340,000 and which Garrett had concealed from the company's outside accountant by classifying the losses as equipment leases. I looked at the documents for a long time. Marcus asked me what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking about a Thanksgiving 15 years ago, when my father spent the whole dinner talking about how Garrett had landed his first big account, a custom home in Hinsdale, and how the business was going to be in good hands. I was 16. I had just won a regional math competition. Nobody mentioned it at dinner. I drove myself to the school the next morning to pick up the certificate because there was nobody available to take me. Marcus didn't say anything, he just waited. I want to understand the full picture first, I told him. Everything. Then we decide what to do." He spent the next 3 weeks compiling it. I drove back to Naperville the week before Christmas and sat in his office again, and this time when he showed me the documents, my understanding of what had happened to Callaway Design and Build shifted into something harder and colder than I expected. The total losses tied to Garrett's decisions, the failed development, the personal expenses, the shell payments were somewhere north of $800,000. The line of credit I had unknowingly backed was nearly maxed. The company's receivables were thin and its outstanding contracts were in jeopardy because 2 major clients had found out the business was behind on its subcontractor payments and had paused their projects pending resolution. The company my father built in a garage was about a quarter turn away from collapse, and I was the co-signatory on the debt that had funded most of the damage. Marcus asked if I was ready to move forward. I thought about my father. I thought about what it would do to him to find out the full extent of what Garrett had done. I thought about my mother, who I genuinely believed had no idea, who had spent 4 years managing my father's health while her son was running the company into the ground. I thought about Garrett texting me from a ski slope not to come home for Thanksgiving. "I want to meet with the family first," I said, "before anything legal. I want them to know what I know." Marcus advised against it. He said that in his experience, once the other party understood the legal exposure, things got complicated fast. I said I understood that. I said I was going to do it anyway. We scheduled it for the week after Christmas. I drove to my parents' house on a Wednesday morning in late December, earlier than they were expecting me. My mother opened the door in her robe, which told me that Garrett had not warned her this was happening, which was exactly what I wanted. She hugged me, asked if I wanted coffee, and I said yes and sat down at the kitchen table where I had done homework and eaten every meal of my childhood. And while she was pouring the coffee, my father came downstairs, slower than I remembered, older in a way that hurt to see. And he looked at me with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, and said, "Hey kiddo." I said, "Dad, we need to talk, and I need Garrett here." My mother set down the coffee and turned to look at me with an expression I recognized from every difficult moment of my childhood, the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to manage the situation or let it unfold. I said, "I know you're going to want to protect him. I know that's your instinct, but I need you to call him and tell him to come here now, because what I have to say affects all of you, and it's better that I say it here than that you find out from someone else." She called him. He showed up 40 minutes later in the new truck, wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, radiating the easy confidence of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. He walked in and saw me, and his expression shifted just enough that I knew he understood why I was there. The 4 of us sat in the living room. The Christmas tree was still up. Outside the window, a neighbor was shoveling their driveway. I put the documents on the coffee table. I had organized them the night before. I walked them through it the same way Marcus had walked me through it, methodically, without raising my voice, starting with the credit agreement and my signature, and working forward through the shell companies and the Joliet development and the vendor payments. My mother's face went pale about 10 minutes in. My father said nothing, just looked at the papers in his hands. Garrett made 2 attempts to interrupt, and both times I kept talking. When I finished, I looked at my brother. "You've been signing contracts using my name," I said. "I have never worked for this company. I have never authorized any of those signatures. You know what that is." He said he could explain. I said I wasn't there for explanations. I said I knew everything and that Marcus Webb had documented everything, and that the only question left was how this was going to be resolved. My father's jaw was tight. He was looking at Garrett in a way I had never seen him look at Garrett, not even once in 31 years, and I understood that something had just ended that couldn't be repaired. My mother said, "Anna, please." Then she caught herself. She almost never used that name anymore. It was the name she called me when she was really scared. I said, "Mom, I know this is hard." She said, "We're a family." She said whatever happened, we could work through it as a family. I said I had been a family member in good standing for 31 years, and for 31 years this family had made a series of decisions that treated me as the person who didn't quite count. I said I had wired money when the business was short. I had signed papers when my father asked. I had shown up every time I was needed, and I had been sent away via text message on Thanksgiving morning. My father closed his eyes. I said I wasn't there to destroy anything. I said I was there because they were my parents and I owed it to them to say this in person rather than let it happen in a courthouse. But I needed Garrett out of the business immediately. I needed a full accounting. And I needed it understood that the situation with my signature was going to be addressed one way or another. Garrett said, "You don't understand what you're doing." I said I understood exactly what I was doing. He stood up. His voice went to a place I recognized from when we were kids, the place where he thought volume would win the argument. He said the business was Dad's, it was the family's. I had walked away. I had gone to Montana. I didn't have the right to walk back in, and I said, "Sit down." He did, actually. I don't think he expected that. I told him Marcus Webb would be in touch with the family's attorney before the end of the week. I told him that if he cooperated, we could potentially structure this in a way that didn't involve criminal charges for the forgery. I told him that was the only offer I was making and it had an expiration date. Then I stood up, put on my coat, and told my parents I loved them. My father still hadn't spoken. My mother was crying. I stood at the door for a moment and thought about saying something else, but there was nothing left that would help, so I said, "Merry Christmas," and I left. The next 6 weeks were not quiet. Garrett hired an attorney who sent a letter claiming the signatures were authorized by verbal agreement, which was not a legal theory that survived contact with Marcus's response. My mother called me 7 times in the first 10 days. My father called once, and that conversation was the hardest thing I had done in years. He didn't apologize exactly, but he said he had known for months that something was wrong and he hadn't wanted to look at it directly, and that was the closest thing to accountability I was going to get from him, and I took it. There was a formal meeting in January, the 4 of us plus both attorneys, at a conference room in a building in downtown Naperville that was so deliberately neutral it felt like the inside of an insurance claim. Garrett came in with his lawyer and the expression of someone who had been convinced he still had options. He did not have options. Marcus laid out the documentation in 45 minutes, and Garrett's attorney said very little, because there was very little to say. "What do you want?" Garrett finally asked. His voice was different in that room, stripped of the easy confidence. "I want you out," I said. "Fully. No title, no role, no access to accounts. As of the end of this month." "And if I don't?" Marcus opened a folder and set it on the table. My mother reached across and put her hand on Garrett's arm, not to stop me. I think it was just the only thing she knew how to do. Garrett's attorney leaned over and said something in a low voice. Garrett sat for a moment. Then he said, "Fine," 1 word. Then he looked at me and said, "You're really doing this?" I said yes. He left without saying anything else. His attorney followed. My mother looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, and I realized I didn't need to read it anymore. She would be okay. She had always been more capable than anyone in the family gave her credit for, herself included. My father shook Marcus's hand. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I said, "I know, Dad." The 3 months after that were some of the hardest work I had ever done. I took a leave from my job in Montana, which my supervisor approved without much pushback, because I had banked an enormous amount of goodwill and flex time over 4 years. I came back to Naperville and I rolled up my sleeves and I looked at what was left of Callaway Design and Build with the same eyes I use when I'm assessing a structure that's been damaged, looking for what's still sound, what has to be replaced, what can be rebuilt. There was more sound than I expected. The company's reputation with clients who weren't involved in the Joliet disaster was intact. The core crew, the foreman, the project managers, the subcontractors who had been with my father for 15 years, those relationships were real. My father, even in his diminished capacity, had lunch with 3 of them in February, and they told him they'd stick around if there was someone trustworthy running things. I brought in an outside accountant to rebuild the books. I restructured the outstanding line of credit with the bank, which required a difficult series of conversations and a personal financial guarantee I did not take lightly. I settled with the 2 clients who had paused their projects by agreeing to a reduced rate on the remaining work and a fixed timeline that I then hit within 2 weeks. I found a project manager named Kevin who had run his own small GC firm before a messy partnership dispute and who knew the suburban Chicago market cold. I paid him well and gave him authority and got out of his way on the operational side. What I contributed was structure. Someone who read every contract before signing it. Someone who looked at the numbers every week. Someone who asked the questions that had gone unasked for 3 years because the person asking would have been inconvenient. By April, the company had taken on 2 new projects. By May, it had paid down a third of the outstanding credit. By summer, my father was showing up at the office 2 days a week, less as a manager and more as a presence, a reminder of what the company was supposed to be. He and I had dinner one night in June at a place in Naperville he had been going to for 20 years. We talked about the bridge project in Montana. We talked about the Hinsdale house from that Thanksgiving dinner when I was 16, which had turned into a relationship with that client's whole extended family. They had hired the company for 3 more projects over the years. He said he thought about that a lot, how one good job compounds over time if you do it right. Then he said, "I should have done better by you. I didn't say it was fine because it wasn't. I didn't list everything because we both already knew. I said, you can do better now." He said he intended to. Garrett moved to Phoenix with Melissa in March. My mother told me this like it was neutral information, which told me she had arrived at some kind of acceptance about it, or at least détente. I heard through her that he had taken a sales job with a property management company. I wished him nothing specific, neither good nor bad. I was done manufacturing feelings about Garrett. I was done with the energy it took. My mother and I had a difficult conversation in April that cleared some air we had both been breathing in for years. She cried and I didn't, which surprised me. She said she had spent a long time telling herself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together, and she had started to understand that it wasn't. I didn't go back to Montana. I hadn't planned that. I planned to get the company stable, hand it to Kevin, and go back to my bridges in my apartment and the version of my life I built in clean air, far from the people who had always made me feel like an afterthought. But something shifted during those months in Naperville. I started to understand the business the way I understood structures, not as a collection of transactions but as a system of relationships under load. And I turned out to be reasonably good at seeing where the load was distributed wrong and correcting it. Kevin asked me in July if I was staying. I said I hadn't decided. He said, for what it's worth, the crew likes you. I said I'd think about it. I went back to Billings in August, packed up my apartment over a long weekend, drove out to the river one last time, and sat there for a while. Montana had given me something I didn't have before I came here, a sense of what I was actually capable of when no one was telling me what I wasn't. I was grateful for that. I took it with me when I drove east. I was in the office in Naperville the first Tuesday of September when my father came in on one of his 2 days. He sat down across from me and put a folder on the desk, the same way I had put a folder on his coffee table 8 months earlier. Inside was a revised ownership structure for Callaway Design and Build, drawn up by the company's attorney. My father's name, my name, a minority stake reserved for Kevin in year 3 if he stayed. He said, "It should have had your name on it from the beginning." I looked at the document for a long time. Outside the office window, the late summer light was doing what it does in Illinois, thick and golden, the kind that only lasts about 6 weeks before it gives way to gray. A crew truck was pulling out of the parking lot. 2 of the guys in it had worked for my father longer than I had been alive. The thing about building structures is that the foundation work is invisible. Nobody drives past a house and thinks about the footings, the rebar, the concrete that was poured and cured before anyone put up a wall. The foundation is just there, holding everything, unremarked upon. For 31 years I had been doing foundation work for a family that looked right through me to the more glamorous parts of the structure. I had propped things up quietly and been thanked quietly and had learned to accept that, quiet as a kind of love, even when it wasn't. I signed the document. Not because everything was repaired. It wasn't, and I didn't pretend it was. My brother was in Phoenix. The years of being overlooked didn't disappear because the ownership structure changed. The memory of that Thanksgiving text lived in my phone's notification history, and I was not going to forget it. But I had stopped needing my family to see me clearly before I could see myself clearly. That had happened somewhere in the months between Marcus Webb's conference room and this parking lot, and I couldn't tell you the exact moment. It happened the way structural change happens, gradually, under pressure, until one day, the load is distributed differently and the whole thing stands better than it did before. My father was looking at me with something I had waited 31 years to see in his face. Not pride, exactly. Recognition. I took the folder, told him I'd have the attorney make one small amendment to the language in Section 3, and said I'd have it back to him by end of week. Then I went back to work. There are people listening to this who know what it feels like to be the person in the family who does the invisible work, who signs the papers and wires the money and shows up every time and still somehow doesn't count. If that's you and you know who you are, I want you to know that the invisible work is real, it matters, and the fact that certain people couldn't see it was never a measure of its worth. It was only ever a measure of theirs. If this story stayed with you, I'm glad. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and if you want to stay for whatever comes next, stay close. There's more. I've thought a lot about the sequence of events that led me to that conference room in Naperville, the certified letter I almost didn't open, the attorney I almost didn't call, the meeting I almost didn't schedule. Every one of those almost didn't moments was a version of me that had been trained over 31 years to make myself smaller so the room felt more comfortable for everyone else. That training runs deep. It doesn't disappear because you finally decide to stop obeying it. What I've come to understand is that the choices Garrett made didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in a system that had always told him his choices didn't carry consequences. Not real ones, not the kind that stuck. My parents loved him in a way that accidentally taught him he was immune. And I had been part of that system too. Every time I wired money without asking questions, every time I signed papers because my father said it was a formality, every time I accepted the Thanksgiving text as something I just had to absorb and move on from. I wasn't innocent of the dynamic. I just wasn't the one who set it up. There's something I want to say about Marcus because I don't think I gave him enough credit in the telling of this. He's an attorney who does quiet, careful work, and he could have made this story very different if he pushed me toward the most aggressive possible outcome from the start. He didn't. He gave me the information, laid out the options, and let me decide what I actually wanted. What I wanted turned out not to be destruction. It turned out to be truth, the full picture, clearly seen by everyone in the room. I think that distinction matters. The difference between wanting justice and wanting to burn something down is real, and getting it wrong costs you something you can't get back. Kevin is still running the day-to-day operations of Callaway Design and Build. He's good at it. He sends me a weekly summary and flags anything that needs a decision, and we talk on Thursdays. My father comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He looks better than he did 18 months ago, which I think is partly the reduced stress and partly the fact that someone he trusts is actually watching the numbers. My mother and I are figuring out something new. It's slower work than the legal stuff, messier, with no documents to sign and no resolution date. But it's real work and we're both doing it, which is more than I could have said 2 years ago. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing that feels most true when I turn it over, is that integrity is not a trait you either have or you don't. It's a practice. Garrett made hundreds of small decisions over several years, each one a little worse than the last. Each one made easier by the fact that the previous one had gone unexamined. And I made my own series of small decisions, to not ask, to not look, to absorb and move on, that made the whole thing possible. None of us arrived at that conference room by accident. I am not the same person who sat in Gate C14 at O'Hare reading a Thanksgiving text with nowhere to go. I'm not sure I can fully describe what's different, but I know it has something to do with understanding that being seen clearly, by yourself, first, is not something anyone else can give you or take away. I waited 31 years for my family to recognize what I was worth. I finally got tired of waiting and just decided it myself. That turned out to be enough. More than enough, actually.